When he awoke, death smiled. Lance Naik Mohan Nath Goswami. Udampa, Jammu and Kashmir, the 1st of September 2015. When he awoke each day, death smiled. It whispered in his ear, its arms outstretched. It stalked him with every crunch that his boots made over beds of dry pine needles, on the snow-blown peaks of mountains few have even heard of. Death would tap him on the shoulder as he trudged forward eagerly through the thickest forests, never hesitating. Like the hundreds of times before, he brushed death off like he would a speck of dirt on his camouflage combat fatigues. N.K. Goswami didn't have time for death. In the final 11 days of his life, he laughed at it straight in the face. And when it was finally time for the dance to end, it was he who let death have him. Willingly, without wavering. And not on death's terms, but his own. Even among the countless tales of unspeakable courage in the Indian Army, the story of Lance Naik Mohan Nath Goswami of the Para-SF is legendary. It is a story that even the army regards not just with pride, but also with a sense of awe and disbelief. It is the story of a man who volunteered for 3 operations over 10 days in 2015, killing 11 terrorists in all. On the 1st of September 2015, N.K. Goswami stretched his legs outside his quarters. At his para-unit headquarters in Udampa, J&K. The unit, respected by other SF units and deeply feared by terrorists who infiltrated across the lock, had a job that none envied. Wearing his combat trousers, boots and a vest, the muscular warrior was fitting a few hours of rest into what had been a week bristling with action and peril. Just 4 days before, in an encounter on a mountainside not far from Rafiabad in Baramulla, N.K. Goswami and his team had eliminated 3 Lashkar-e-Taiba terrorists over an extended, furious, 2-day firefight. The squad had even managed to capture a 4th terrorist, a Pakistani national, alive. N.K. Goswami never breathed easy, but as he strolled back and forth that morning 4 days later outside his unit camp, he did the one thing he loved more than hunting terrorists. N.K. Goswami used his cell phone to call his wife, Borna, at the small home in Lalkuan village, about 30 kilometers outside Uttarakhand's popular hill station of Nainital. The two would speak for a few minutes every day when possible. A gap, and this was often always told Borna that N.K. Goswami had set off on an operation. That morning, the phone didn't need to ring a second time for her to pick up. It was a very personal conversation on the 1st of September, Borna recalls. Mohan spoke about the future, about our lives and how we needed to plan. He would constantly remind me of how uncertain a commando's life is, and how anything could happen at any time, and how we must prepare. But he said nothing like that in his last call. He was very matter-of-fact in his manner. He was building a new house for us across the path from where we live. All I wanted to know was how he was holding up, and all he would say was he was hoping to complete the construction of our new house the following March when he came home. The warrior had been home in the hills of Uttarakhand the previous month for his daughter Bhumika's 7th birthday. It had been 2 weeks of real rest before he took his train back to Udampa and onward back to the unit he loved. Barely a week after his return to Kashmir, N.K. Goswami would set off on the first of his final 3 operations. Physically supremely fit, it hadn't taken N.K. Goswami more than a few hours to work his muscles back into action mode following a fortnight of relative repose with his family. He had been raring to set off on another hunt the moment he stepped off the train at Udampa on Independence Day 2015. On the 21st of August 2015, a Para-SF squad led by a young officer, Captain Daiksh Mehra, was deployed to hunt terrorists near a remote village named Kamur in North Kashmir's Handwara district. The intelligence was solid. 3 terrorists were expected to arrive at a designated spot to receive 6 more who had freshly crossed the lock. The warriors lay waiting. On the night of the 22nd of August, while the squad descended the mountain towards Kamur village, they spotted the shadows of 3 terrorists right in front of them in the dark. One was walking in a battle-ready position in front like a commando scout, followed by 2 behind. All 3 were carrying AK-47 rifles. 2 had heavy rucksacks, presumably filled with ammunition and provisions. Through the darkness, the commandos spotted them at a distance of no more than 10 meters. The warriors had night vision glasses, but the foliage was very dense. The squad needed to make sure they were not civilians or woodcutters, or maybe even another army unit that had accidentally stepped into the path of the para squad on the hunt. They had to carry out a challenge protocol, an inherently dangerous task that involves calling out to the other. This was a face-on moving contact at very close range, recalls a warrior who was part of the operation. As soon as they were challenged, the terrorists opened fire in our squad's direction. We returned fire. Captain Mera was hit by a ricocheting bullet. In the darkness it wasn't clear how serious the injury was. As a fierce, close-range firefight broke out that night in Handwara, back at the squad's headquarters in Udampa, N.K. Goswami and March Anurag Kumar were getting set to depart in a squad vehicle on a separate mission with 2 more para-commandos. N.K. Goswami was eager to begin, looking at a piece of paper containing the input, while pacing excitedly in the small room where the men had met that night. N.K. Goswami said over and over again, Paka Kuch Hoga, yes, solid input, hi, something will definitely happen, this is credible information, insisting they leave immediately. When not on an operation, N.K. Goswami was known to sit from morning to night near the unit's anchor, the communication set that was used to convey inputs on terrorists, or summon the warriors on a hunt. In ways that even his comrades sometimes failed to fathom, living, for N.K. Goswami, was the lull between operations. The 4 men departed late that night in a squad vehicle. The plan was to gather reinforcements on the way and arrive at a contact site where intelligence had reported the presence of at least 10 terrorists. They were 20 minutes away from the contact spot when they received a message on their portable communication. Mera Saab ko lag gayi, Mera sir has been shot, said a voice at the other end. It was from Commure. N.K. Goswami immediately asserted to his colleagues, Mera Saab gayal ho gaye hain. Wahin Piturant Chalt Hain, Mera sir is injured. Let us go there immediately. March Kumar, the only officer among the 4, paused, wondering if this was wise. Wading into a live firefight could be a terribly risky proposition for them. But N.K. Goswami implored the officer, saying there was nothing more important than reaching the comrades in trouble. As team commander, I had to think for the whole squad. Their lives were my responsibility. But N.K. Goswami had amazing persuading power. This was emotional work for him. He would not let go, remembers March Kumar. He asked N.K. Goswami to calm down and think straight. There were conflicting reports from the Commure site about precisely what kind of trouble Captain Mera's squad was in. Did they really need to divert there instead of continuing with the separate mission to hunt 10 terrorists? By now N.K. Goswami was beseeching the officer. We have to go there. We will regret it forever if it turns out that Mera Saab could have been saved if we had intervened on time. We don't have a choice, N.K. Goswami had said. By this time, word had also reached him that the terrorists in Commure may have also had a Pulmayo Kalashnikov machine gun, a brute force weapon that the para-commandos would have found near impossible to dodge in such a close engagement. Worst, communication from the squad at Commure had fallen silent. Was it all over? It was the trigger needed for a final decision. March Kumar ordered the vehicle to turn around and head straight towards Commure at full throttle. As the vehicle tore through the night at a speed of 120 km/h, N.K. Goswami sat up straight, every bit of his posture ready to leap out and into battle. About 200 meters short of the contact site in Commure, N.K. Goswami asked the vehicle's driver to switch off the headlamps, sensing they were exposed. He was right. The moment the lights were switched off, a hail of bullets clattered around the car, missing it by barely a few feet. The terrorists had seen the approaching vehicle and let loose a few shots directly at it. The 4 para-warriors scrambled out of the car and began the careful trek through the darkness in the general direction of the terrorists. N.K. Goswami led the way. Mohan Nath always led from the front, in the dangerous but critical scout position, recalls March Kumar. I would often tell him he was senior enough now, and that he should let younger warriors play scout to get experience. His reply was always the same, and there was no arrogance in it, just plain, honest opinion. Sub mujh ka kaun ka sakta hai. "Sir, who can do it better than I?" He promised that if anyone proved more effective than him as a scout, he would personally invite that person to lead. Until a better warrior was found, L.N.K. Goswami wouldn't risk the lives of the men he was with. He was clear about that. Though the squad had just faced fire, they only had a general six-figure grid reference, a rough geographical coordinate, on the location of the terrorists who had let loose the volley of bullets. The four men crept down the path towards the 100 square m area that would be their hunting ground in the dark. On the fringes of Kamur village, as the land rose into a forested Handwara hillside, the four warriors got onto the bellies. In the darkness, 20 meters up that same hillside, were the terrorists with their weapons. And 10 meters away from them lay an injured captain. Dijksmera along with the rest of his squad. Intermittent fire rang out at close quarters. L.N.K. Goswami and the other three warriors had crept right up to the firefight, positioning themselves flat on the ground under a large tree. The situation was ripe for disaster. With neither squad accurately aware of where the other was, the risk of shots being fired at mistaken targets was very real. L.N.K. Goswami quickly slithered over to March Kumar and told him to convey on the communication set to the other squad that he would be blinking his flashlight to indicate his position, a terribly dangerous move in the situation, but it was the only way to take the next step. March Kumar once again cautioned him, saying the flashlight would paint a big fat target sign on them for the terrorists to fire at. L.N.K. Goswami was nonchalant. "Let 'em fire at us, sir. This tree will protect us." March Kumar was right. As the flashlight was switched on, a burst of Kalashnikov fire exploded down the hillside towards the four men under the tree. And as L.N.K. Goswami had predicted, the fat branches of the tree took much of the fire. Their position now revealed, the squad engaged directly with the militants, with L.N.K. Goswami managing to quickly kill one. Captain Mera's squad quickly relocated to join their four comrades at the base of the hill. As the terrifying close combat continued, L.N.K. Goswami helped the injured captain out of the area, his arm slung across his shoulder. All the while, he kept himself between the injured man and the firing terrorists, just in case a bullet managed to find him in the darkness. By morning, the other two terrorists had been killed too. Operation Kamur, as it was later formally code-named, was a victory, and a powerful message to the terror training camps in POC. August was the heart of the waning summer season, and every soldier in the state knows what that means, that terror groups would be looking to crank up the infiltrations and replenish their hidden cells on India's side of the lock before the unforgiving winter put a virtual stop to any such cross-border activity. The next 2 months would see a visible ramping up of scale and audacity. L.N.K. Goswami and his team knew that squads like theirs were India's principal weapon against this annual rising tide. The squad had barely squeezed in a 2-day lull when a fresh intelligence input trickled into the camp on the morning of the 26th of August. They hadn't expected much rest anyway. Para squads never do. 5 Pakistani terrorists had infiltrated across the lock in the Uri sector. It was a difficult entry point, with some of Kashmir's most hostile terrain, but one that afforded several hiding places. The 5 had trekked over the Shamshabari range, scaled the formidable Kalapahar mountain and weathered the 4,000-meter-high Kazi Nagdar as they made their way towards the more manageable lowlands of the Kashmir Valley. One of the men had been shot dead in a brief encounter with men from the Army's 35 Rashtriya Rifles on a remote ridgeline on the Shamshabari. The other 4 had escaped at double speed, taking advantage of the evasive tactics that are a special part of terrorist training. Minutes after killing one of the 5, the leader of the 35 Rashtriya Rifles team at the site had quickly called for a drone to track the 4 terrorists who had escaped. A Searcher Mark II drone was scrambled immediately from an airbase in the Kashmir Valley, darting straight and high over the Shamshabari range, its cameras and thermal images switched on. Infiltrating terrorists make sure they limit their movement by day, using the darkness to cover ground and head to the destinations. But before sunrise on the 26th of August, the featureless crests of the Shamshabari gave the drone a perfect view of the terrorists in the dark, the bodies showing up as 4 hot blotches ambling over the featureless expanse of the range. The drone would remain in the air, tracking their every movement as they made their way towards Baramulla. The 4 men could be seen climbing down a hillside littered with enormous boulders and, apparently, a network of caves and crevasses. At 0545 hours, with the sun now out, the drone witnessed the 4 men stopping and taking cover. This would be their last known location. An hour earlier, over at the Para-SF Unit's headquarters, N.K. Goswami was among 12 men who were issued a warning order, placing them on operational standby to be dropped from a helicopter onto that boulder-strewn ridge to hunt and kill the 4 infiltrators. By 0700 hours, an Army Drove chopper lifted off from Udampa with the 12 commandos, including N.K. Goswami and Marge Kumar, taking a deliberately circuitous route before finally identifying a landing zone on the ridge and dropping the warriors off at 0930 hours. The fully armed men grouped for a quick execution plan for a hunt that would later be codenamed Operation Liderpanzel. The landing zone was about 4 kilometers away from the last known location of the terrorists as designated by the Searcher Mark II drone, which was still in the air above the range. 12 of India's most hardened warriors were on the hunt for the 4 terrorists. But even they knew that being transplanted to a 4,000-meter altitude would substantially limit the true strength. The thinner air would bring on fatigue faster. And this being an airborne operation, each man had a combat load of over 40 kilograms. As they gazed up at the ridge, none of the dozen knew just how long the hunt that lay before them would stretch on for. As the men began the careful trek through a maze of boulders along the ridgeline, the drone kept the warriors in its sight, its pilot sitting far away at a secret location, updating the para-commandos in real time about how close they were to where the terrorists were believed to be resting. The men trudged on towards the quarry, crossing a glacial lake and uninterrupted mountain terrain. By noon, they were close. As always, N.K. Goswami led the squads as the scout out in front. Marge Kumar remembers how N.K. Goswami actually managed to keep the squads a step ahead of the technologically advanced drone that buzzed high above them. He used his terrain wisdom to detect a trail, something that the drone couldn't see. Mohan actually discerned what he was sure were footprints in the misty dew that settled on the patches of grass between rocks at that altitude. Marge Kumar remembers. Some of the men were skeptical, wondering whether N.K. Goswami was reading too much into what he saw on the ground. But the warrior was certain. Isi taraf shege hai, sir. Contact Humko Mil Jayega. They have definitely passed through here. We will find them. N.K. Goswami said, bending down to scrutinize a trail that was clear to him and apparently nobody else. Not for the first time, team leader Marge Kumar decided to go with N.K. Goswami's gut. He dispatched one squad down the trail N.K. Goswami had found, and sent the second one higher up the ridge to take a commanding position in case the terrorists were waiting in ambush. I have never known a Highlander like Mohan. If he hadn't spotted the trail in the mountain dew, we were almost certainly headed into an ambush situation, remembers Marge Kumar. We would have lost men. By this time, the Army drone pilot had communicated to the para team that the 4 terrorists were hiding inside a cave at the target location. The 2 squads had split up through the boulders, agreeing to arrive at the cave at precisely the same time. The tactic was simple. 2 teams arriving from 2 different directions would distract and divide the attention of the terrorists, halving the effectiveness of the possible retaliation. An hour later, the squad taking the higher path along the ridge communicated to the trail squad below saying they had spotted something suspicious in the shadow of a huge 30-foot boulder. It was a grey ferran, the traditional woolly, robe-like garment worn in the state. The squad leader reported that he was about to fling a pair of grenades down at the boulder. He was asked to wait, because by this time N.K. Goswami had walked far ahead on the trail and reached the cave all alone. A fierce firefight immediately erupted. N.K. Goswami fired with his TAR-21 rifle, taking cover behind a low boulder in a small open area outside the cave's mouth. When the firing slowed, N.K. Goswami jogged back up the trail to the rest of his squad, briefing them on what had just happened. Marge Kumar remembers N.K. Goswami's face. I had never seen him calmer. He had just come back to us after a few minutes of heavy firing at close range with 4 militants. But he wasn't even excited. All he said was, "Sir Bond Dick Gay." I Ekolagi Hi. Sir, I have seen 'em. And one of them has been hit. The major immediately cordoned off the area surrounding the cave, a 50x 30-meter piece of land strewn with high boulders, creating an insidious maze. 12 armed warriors stood waiting, their weapons trained directly at the mouth of the cave. The militants had been cornered. Storming the cave wasn't an option without incurring casualties, remembers March. Kumar, we had rations and water. We had ammunition too, so we decided to wait the night and draw them out. N.K. Goswami Saturday on the cave's right at a distance of 15 meters. If the terrorists emerged, they would be cut down by a C-shaped formation of soldiers. Night fell heavily on the tired dozen. There would be no rest, sitting as they were, flexed and primed for action through an uncomfortable, chilly night that brought waves of the same dew that had caught N.K. Goswami's attention and led the men to the target earlier that day. In turns, they gratefully ate packed dinner of puri and pickle. To send the hold-up terrorists a clear message that there was no way out, a soldier was ordered to fire 2 rocket-propelled grenades into the clearing outside the cave at night. In the concussive blast, 2 terrorists emerged from the cave in panic, trying to make a desperate run for it. The moment they emerged into the open area, 2 shots were heard. N.K. Goswami, his TAR-21 in his favorite single-shot mode, fired 2 quick rounds, abruptly ending the escape bid. In such a situation, men usually fire their weapon in bursts. They want to be sure. Mohan fired just 2 shots, recalls March. Kumar, who had been sitting just a few feet away from N.K. Goswami when he fired. Just 2 rounds. He was that confident of his skill. After all the firing, a deathly quiet descended on the ridge that night. The Para-SF squads were running low on support ammunition too, so they decided to wait till morning to see if the remaining 2 terrorists could be drawn out. It would be a long, sleepless wait. Till noon the next day, the 27th of August, there hadn't been another sound. 4 men, including N.K. Goswami and March Kumar, began a hectic search operation in the area around the cave. The mandatory task was to ensure that the terrorists hadn't, by some slim chance, emerged in the darkness and relocated to a different position. With N.K. Goswami once again as scout leader out in front, the 4 men crept between the boulders, their weapons cocked and ready. The 3 men heard a series of shots from N.K. Goswami's rifle up ahead as a fresh firefight erupted. Creeping up virtually silently around a boulder, N.K. Goswami had spotted the leg of one of the hiding terrorists behind another boulder. He had immediately aimed and fired at the leg, sparking a volley of return fire from a crevasse behind the boulder. N.K. Goswami returned to the 3 others, and all 4 took position, their weapons now aimed directly up the path towards the boulder. Moments later, screaming slogans in a hoarse shriek, the injured terrorist hobbled out into the clearing, firing his weapon only to be cut down instantly by the 4 waiting warriors. Only 1 terrorist now remained alive, and the squad knew he was fully cornered, deep inside a cave behind the boulder. March Kumar remembers wanting to empty the last of his squad's rocket-propelled grenades into the cave, sealing the last terrorist's fate where he hid. We wanted to finish up and induct. We were out of rations too, he recalls. But N.K. Goswami broke the bristling silence. Stepping towards the cave, he cupped his hands around his mouth and made a loud call. By Jan Abhi Bhi Morka Hai. Aap surrender kar do. Baha nikal jao. Kis lier man ki lier ho. Brother, there is still a chance. Surrender and come out of the cave. Do you want to die here? N.K. Goswami was speaking firmly, but on that windswept mountain ridge, there was a gentleness in his voice as he called into the gaping maw of that mountain cave. The terrorists had been trekking for 5 days through the harshest terrain Kashmir could offer. N.K. Goswami knew that they would be at the end of their reserves, their energy and perhaps their sanity. That was his presence of mind. He knew the terrorist would have no heart left for a fight. It was the perfect opportunity to capture him alive. That's what Mohan did, remembers March Kumar. Many minutes later, the last terrorist finally hobbled out of the cave, his hands up. Emaciated, thirsty, with bloodshot eyes, he stood in front of the men, saying nothing. L.N.K. Goswami turned towards March Kumar. Both men knew they couldn't kill him. The men secured the terrorist, giving him the last of the food and water. He was Sajjad Ahmed, alias Abu Ubaidullah, a young man from Muzaffargarh in Pakistan. He had been recruited into the Lashkar-e-Taiba and trained like a commando to infiltrate India and inflict casualties in population centers. His testimony would go on to add to the already enormous dossier of evidence India had in Pakistan-sponsored terror. With their very valuable captive, the men summoned a helicopter to fly them back to base. Mohan was far above the standards of even our battalion. Trust me, that's saying a lot, says March Kumar, who was later awarded the Shaurya Chakra for his leadership during the operation. He was as intelligent and emotional as he was fit. The men would get a bonus of just 3 days before they got the next call. L.N.K. Goswami's next operation began on the 2nd of September. Barely rested after the Lider Panjal mission, L.N.K. Goswami and his squad were put on scramble alert for the 3rd time that week. It was a month that perfectly defined the relentless high-tempo operations that are the unique preserve of the Para-SF. The intelligence this time was about 6 fresh infiltrators on their way across the remote Satsalia forests of Kupwara, one of Kashmir's densest jungles. Visibility through the foliage was never more than 3 meters. The squad planned a long-haul operation of 96 hours with 6 squads of 36 men who would lie in wait for the infiltrators. The men were on location by first light on the 1st of September. Splitting into 2 groups, the teams deployed on either side of a wide mountain stream flowing through the forest. While the men knew the terrorists would arrive, the intelligence they had was not specific on precisely which direction they would come from. That explained the larger number of para-commandos in what the regiment calls a speculative ambush. A bigger number had a greater tactical chance of knocking out the terrorists before they had an opportunity to act. At 2030 hours, L.N.K. Goswami's squad detected the terrorists as they arrived in the area. The intelligence had proved to be very good. There were 4 of them, as the input had said. The squads, positioned in buddy pairs through the forest trail, had set down claymore mines. Unlike landmines, claymore mines are detonated on remote command and designed to have their explosive effect pointed in a certain direction. But the terrorists arrived from an entirely unexpected direction, giving L.N.K. Goswami and the other troops barely a few minutes to readjust and reconfigure. But first, as always, the infiltrators needed to be challenged by the para-commandos. It remains one of the most risky standard operating procedures, but SF units have no way around it yet. Since such operations take place among Indian citizens and on Indian territory, protocol demands that every precaution be taken before hostile action. Challenging someone in such a situation instantly gives away your position, allowing the challenged party to take the first shot. As the 4 figures were spotted in the darkness, it surprised nobody that L.N.K. Goswami volunteered once again to step forward and challenge the intruders. Taking cover behind foliage, L.N.K. Goswami shouted into the shadows, demanding to know who the 4 men were. In the darkness of that forest in Kupwara, the response was instantaneous. The clatter of assault rifle fire immediately broke out. In the first few minutes, one of the 4 terrorists was hit by a shot. L.N.K. Goswami fired, but not killed. The close fire exchange continued for several minutes. But then it began to drizzle, and the guns fell silent. The terrorists didn't dare move in case they gave away their locations. And the hunting commandos waited, watching through night vision devices that were virtually useless in such foliage and weather. As they waited, shortly after midnight, the squads were caught off guard by a loud explosion in a tree above them. It took seconds for the soldiers to realize that the terrorists had fired from an under-barrel grenade launcher attached to their AK-47 rifles. Splinters from the exploding grenade rained down on 2 commandos positioned under the tree, tearing open wounds on the sides of the faces. Positioned a few meters away in the darkness, L.N.K. Goswami was watching. And he knew what he needed to do. He always did. If there was one impulse stronger than killing terrorists, it was L.N.K. Goswami's overpowering need to make sure he evacuated a comrade injured in an encounter. The two wounded commandos were now pinned down, sitting ducks for whatever would come next. N.K. Goswami and his buddy, Havildar Mahendra Singh, sprang from their location towards the two injured men, their assault rifles at the ready for what N.K. Goswami knew would be a hail of bullets directed straight at him. He was right. The terrorist who had fired the grenade moments earlier now opened a burst of fire with his assault rifle, cutting down Singh with a bullet that entered his abdomen and went straight into his spine, instantly paralyzing the lower half of his body. N.K. Goswami knew that in the next few seconds, his buddy would be torn to shreds in the volley of following bullets. His weapon now in burst mode, N.K. Goswami sprang from his cover position, firing furiously at the terrorists. Two bullets tore through N.K. Goswami's waist, one passing straight through him, the other lodged inside. As he crumpled sideways with a roar, he kept his weapon pointed straight, meeting the two advancing terrorists with a spurt of shots, killing him just as he crashed to the ground. Bleeding from his gunshot wounds, N.K. Goswami attempted to crawl towards Mahendra and the two injured Jawans under the tree. But as the rain came down a little harder, washing his wounds, N.K. Goswami seemed to decide to let death have him. With cover fire from March Kumar, N.K. Goswami crawled forward in the darkness towards Mahendra Singh. The injured soldier was quickly secured and pulled to safety for evacuation. Then March Kumar, now on his elbows, pulled himself towards the fallen figure of his favorite soldier. I Saturday with Mohan, holding his hands through the night. There was no pulse. He would have done the same for me. He would not have left me. March Kumar remembers those moments every day since it happened. Sitting there with him, his flesh cold, I don't remember anything feeling more unreal. A good part of me said he would wake up. This wasn't a man who could be felled by bullets. And yet here he was, cold. The disbelief stretched out through that rainy night. For many moments, I wondered if this was another one of his tactics. To play dead so he could spring up to kill the remaining terrorists. March Kumar says, smiling. I actually waited, hoping that was true. I have lost men before, but I couldn't come to terms with it. I waited till sunrise to see if he would wake up. The next day, the officers and Jawans of the unit held a Badakana, an alcohol-fueled banquet at their headquarters. Through the disbelief and mourning, there was sweeping pride. A man who had walked among them as jovial as he was fearless, had signed off in the only way he could have wanted, on his terms, doing what he loved. Over drinks to dull the disbelief and sorrow, the men raised the glasses to N.K. Mohan Nath Goswami that night, hailing him loudly for his fierceness in battle and generosity in victory. He was the very core of an SF soldier. He loved his family and missed them every day. And he was married to the adrenaline of combat. As the national media stood mesmerized by the tale of N.K. Goswami, his mortal remains would travel by road up the hills of Uttarakhand to his wife in their village. Viewers across the country would watch the stoic figure of Borna Goswami next to N.K. Mohan Nath Goswami's flag-draped casket. Through uncontrollable tears, his mother, Radha Devi, would appeal to the government, build a school in his name, a playground in his name. This is what he cherished as a child. This is what he would have wanted for others. He knowingly pushed himself into a hail of bullets to save his comrade, a lieutenant colonel with the unit, who led N.K. Goswami years ago as a troop commander, remembers. We are all working for the country. But in an SF unit, you are also working for each other. He was emotionally attached to us and his work. He was an ideal SF commando. That unwillingness to countenance suffering stretched beyond the battlefield. He had a very soft corner for those suffering, recalls N.K. Goswami's wife, Borna. If he saw a poor person or someone mentally disturbed, he would give them his clothes. He would never give beggars a rupee or two, he would give them 100 rupees. A Yogi Baba once came to him in a market and asked him to buy him some grapes. He bought him a kilo of grapes. Once, he took off his shirt and jacket and gave it to a naked beggar. He was like that. 4 months after Operation Satsalya, Borna Goswami would make her way to Delhi to receive N.K. Goswami's posthumous Ashok Chakra, the country's highest decoration for gallantry in peacetime. She steeled herself as it drizzled that morning on Delhi's Rajpath. Before we got married, he always said to me that I needed to be prepared for anything. I did feel scared, but it was written in our destinies that we would make our lives together, Borna, who still lives in Lalkuan, says. In my heart, a voice would tell me that as a commando's wife, I needed to be as fearless as he was. If one has to die, it can be anywhere. Bhumika L. N.K. Goswami's daughter is now in a boarding school not far from home. For us, he is always here. He will be with us for a lifetime. It's just that I can no longer see him. He walks with me. He even talks to me. But I cannot see him. A signboard, Shaheed Mohan Nath Goswami, points to the couple's small home. After his death, Borna decided not to complete the construction of the bigger house they had been building across the path from where they live. My nephews want to be like Mohan. All the children in our family want to take his legacy forward. They say, he killed 10 terrorists, we will kill 20. In the many tales of inspiring courage in the Special Forces, an abnormal, nearly magical film coats the tale of L. N.K. Mohan Nath Goswami. His call sign was Jadugar, magician, remembers a fellow warrior who accompanied him on that final mission. I don't think I will ever see a braver person than him facing fire.